The myth of the Danaides, 50 daughters of King Danaus who murdered their husbands on their wedding night, has served as a rich source of inspiration across centuries of art. Condemned to an eternal punishment of carrying water in leaky vessels, the Danaides symbolize guilt, resistance, and the futility of endless labor. From ancient Greek pottery to modern installations, artists have reimagined their story to reflect changing ideas about justice, female agency, and human suffering. Through these evolving depictions, the Danaides have remained powerful icons of mythological tragedy and cultural reflection. The tale of the Danaides stands as a powerful fusion of myth, morality, and the enduring human struggle with fate and choice. In ancient Greek mythology, Danaus, the king of Libya, had 50 daughters, while his twin brother Aegyptus, the king of Egypt, had 50 sons. Aegyptus proposed a mass marriage between their children to unite the kingdoms, but Danaus, distrusting his brother's motives, fled with his daughters to Argos in Greece. Despite his resistance, the marriages were eventually arranged, though Danaus, still suspicious and fearful, instructed each of his daughters to kill her new husband on their wedding night. Obeying his command, all but one of the Danaides carried out the murders, plunging daggers into their husbands as they slept. Only Hypermnestra chose compassion over obedience and spared her husband Lynceus, citing his respect for her autonomy. This act of mercy would eventually lead to the continuation of the Danaid bloodline and the founding of the royal house of Argos. However, the other 49 sisters were condemned by the gods for their crimes. In Hades, they were punished with an agonizing and eternal chore: to fill a basin using jugs of water that leaked continuously, symbolizing fruitless labor and the inescapable weight of sin. This myth is more than a tale of betrayal. It raises timeless questions about authority, resistance, justice, and personal conscience. In Greek culture, it became an allegory for endless suffering and the futility of certain human endeavors. Over the centuries, the Danaides have become enduring symbols in art, not only of punishment and remorse but also of female agency, rebellion, and the tragic consequences of familial loyalty gone awry. Their myth served as a compelling narrative for artists, dramatists, and philosophers seeking to explore the deeper currents of human morality and divine retribution. In classical antiquity, the myth of the Danaides was far more than a simple tale of betrayal and punishment. It carried profound symbolic significance that resonated with ancient Greek cultural, moral, and philosophical ideals. The Danaides came to represent multiple facets of human experience, particularly the struggle between obedience and individual conscience, as well as the consequences of defiance against divine or patriarchal authority. Their eternal punishment, in Hades, carrying water in vessels with holes, was not merely a narrative device but a deeply embedded metaphor for futile labor, endless repentance, and unfulfilled duty. In ancient Greek society, this symbolism aligned closely with the belief in divine justice, dike, and retribution, nemesis. The imagery of the leaking vessels also reflected the Greek concept of hubris, excessive pride or defiance of the gods, which invariably led to downfall and eternal suffering. The Danaides' task mirrored other cursed figures, such as Sisyphus and Tantalus, whose punishment symbolized eternal frustration and the hopeless repetition of meaningless labor. In a broader sense, the myth reinforced societal values concerning loyalty to the patriarch, the danger of unchecked female agency, and the severe consequences of breaking sacred marital bonds. Despite their grim fate, the Danaides became compelling figures of mythological literature and tragedy, often used to provoke philosophical reflection on justice, morality, and the human condition. The myth of the Danaides found visual expression early in ancient Greek art, where their dramatic story was depicted with emotive intensity on pottery, friezes, and temple decorations. These artworks aimed not only to capture the mythological narrative, but also to visually reinforce the cultural values and moral warnings embedded in the story. On black figure and red figure pottery dating from the 6th to the 4th century BCE, artists often illustrated key moments from the myth, the weddings, the murders, or the anguished aftermath. In some scenes, the Danaides are shown wielding daggers, their faces marked with a mix of determination and dread, emphasizing the emotional turmoil of their actions. Public art, including temple friezes and stone reliefs, also portrayed the Danaides as part of larger mythological tableaux, often juxtaposed with other tragic figures condemned to Hades. These artistic interpretations did not always focus on the violence, but often highlighted the punishment. Women stooped in agony, attempting to pour water into bottomless vessels, their toil frozen in stone. The repetition of this imagery across different media served to etch the Danaides into the collective consciousness as symbols of suffering, justice, and eternal consequence. Moreover, their presence in sacred or civic spaces was a visual reminder of the price of defiance and the moral expectations placed on women and families in ancient Greek society. As Greek mythology was absorbed into Roman culture, the story of the Danaides was reinterpreted through the lens of Roman values and aesthetics. While the core narrative remained largely intact, the Romans emphasized different aspects of the myth, often infusing it with moralistic or theatrical overtones. In Roman literature, such as the works of Ovid and Seneca, the Danaides were portrayed with a greater focus on psychological conflict and internal guilt, sometimes seen more as tragic victims of circumstance than solely as murderers. This shift reflected the Roman fascination with inner torment, honor, and the philosophical debate around fate versus free will. Artistically, the Danaides appeared in Roman frescoes, mosaics, and funerary art, often shown in their eternal punishment in the underworld. Roman artists were particularly drawn to the emotional weight of the myth, capturing the anguish, weariness, and desperation of the sisters as they attempted to complete their impossible task. The Danaides became symbolic not just of female defiance or sin, but also of human suffering more broadly, fitting into the Roman worldview that emphasized the tragic dimension of human existence and the inevitability of divine justice. In elite households, depictions of the Danaides served both as aesthetic pieces and as moral lessons, visual allegories reminding viewers of the dangers of disobedience, the weight of guilt, and the futility of resisting divine or social order. Renaissance period, marked by a renewed interest in classical antiquity, saw a resurgence of the Danaides myth in visual art, literature, and humanist scholarship. Artists and thinkers of the 15th to 17th centuries were captivated by the emotional and symbolic depth of the myth, using it to explore themes of virtue, sin, repentance, and the tragic female figure. Renaissance painters often focused on the dramatic and emotionally charged scenes, the murders on the wedding night, the sorrowful aftermath, or the endless punishment in the underworld. These depictions were no longer strictly didactic, but also aimed at evoking empathy and reflection. Painters such as Jan Bruegel the Elder and other Northern European artists approached the myth with a moralizing tone, portraying the Danaides as both perpetrators and victims, torn between paternal obedience and their own conscience. In Italy, where classical mythology blended with Christian iconography, the story of the Danaides took on layered meanings. Some artists depicted their suffering in Hades as a visual parallel to the Christian concept of purgatory or penance, aligning with themes of divine justice and moral consequence. The Renaissance also brought a new focus on individual expression and emotional realism, so the Danaides began to appear not just as symbolic figures, but as women with anguish in their eyes and weariness in their posture, embodiments of psychological and spiritual torment. This renewed visual interest in the Danaides helped solidify their place in the Western artistic canon as archetypes of tragic femininity and eternal burden. The 18th and 19th centuries, an era dominated by Romanticism and Neoclassicism, ushered in a dramatic shift in the artistic portrayal of the Danaides. Romanticism, with its emphasis on emotion, individual suffering, and the sublime, found fertile ground in the tragic myth of the Danaides. Artists and writers were drawn to the psychological depth and aesthetic grandeur of the story. The Danaides were now often represented not simply as mythological figures of punishment, but as tragic heroines, women torn by fate, guilt, and emotional torment. Their endless punishment in the underworld was portrayed with poetic melancholy, reflecting broader romantic themes of existential despair, lost virtue, and doomed love. Neoclassical artists, inspired by the ideals of ancient Greece and Rome, emphasized harmony, idealized beauty, and heroic tragedy. Sculptors such as Antonio Canova and painters like Jacques-Louis David reimagined the Danaides with an eye for both anatomical precision and dramatic expression. In neoclassical sculpture, the Danaides were often presented as draped, sorrowful, women in dynamic poses, vessels in hand, heads bowed, embodying eternal labor and graceful suffering. Their punishment became an allegory for the moral consequences of rebellion and the inevitability of divine justice, rendered with balance and clarity in stone and canvas. These movements, though stylistically distinct, shared a fascination with the emotional and symbolic richness of the myth. The Romantic era gave the Danaides a haunting sorrow and personal depth, while neoclassicism elevated them into icons of mythological elegance and tragic grandeur. In both cases, the Danaides became enduring symbols of human fallibility, punishment, and the thin line between justice and tragedy. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, artists began to reinterpret the Danaides through more psychological and abstract lenses, influenced by symbolism and modernism. Symbolist painters like Gustave Moreau viewed myths not as moral lessons, but as gateways into the subconscious, dreams, and the human psyche. In this context, the Danaides were stripped of their traditional narrative framing and reimagined as metaphors for internal conflict, forbidden desire, and the futility of human striving. Their leaky water vessels came to symbolize emotional emptiness, psychological trauma, or the cyclical nature of suffering, rather than literal punishment. Modernist movements like Expressionism and Surrealism also found in the Danaides a powerful metaphor for alienation and absurdity. The repetitive, meaningless labor of filling bottomless vessels was interpreted as a reflection of modern existential crises, echoing themes found in the works of Camus and Kafka. Artists moved away from the classical depiction of the female form and instead distorted or fragmented their bodies, emphasizing emotional turmoil over physical beauty. In some works, the Danaides appear ghost-like, dissolving into their surroundings, trapped in a surreal and timeless cycle of despair. This era also began to question traditional gender narratives. Some feminist artists saw the Danaides not as guilty sinners, but as victims of patriarchal control and violence. Their story was reclaimed as a commentary on forced marriage, silencing of female voices, and the generational trauma of women punished for resisting male authority. In modern art, the Danaides became haunting and complex figures, not just mythical daughters of a Greek king, but universal representations of suffering, resistance, and the endless human struggle for meaning and freedom. In contemporary art, the myth of the Danaides continues to evolve, finding new life in visual, conceptual, and performance art that challenges traditional interpretations. Today's artists approach the myth not as a relic of antiquity, but as a dynamic framework to explore modern issues such as gender, trauma, identity, labor, and resistance. The image of the Danaides, endlessly filling broken vessels, has become a powerful metaphor for systemic oppression, emotional burnout, and the invisible labor often shouldered by women and marginalized groups. Feminist artists, in particular, have reimagined the Danaides as survivors of coercion and patriarchal violence. Rather than portraying them as villains or sinners, contemporary reinterpretations emphasize their lack of agency in a world where obedience to male authority was enforced through fear and power. Installations and multimedia works often depict the Danaides as ghost-like or fragmented figures, reflections of women caught in cycles of sacrifice and silence. Their eternal punishment becomes a symbol of inherited trauma passed down through generations of women forced to bear the burden of other people's expectations. Conceptual and performance artists have also utilized the myth to comment on modern life's repetitive, exhausting tasks. In gallery spaces, some recreate the futile act of filling leaky vessels, using water, sand, or digital media to evoke the frustration of endless, meaningless work, echoing the stress and alienation of late capitalist society. In this way, the myth transcends its mythological roots and becomes a poignant reflection on contemporary experiences, connecting ancient tragedy to the emotional realities of the modern world. The story of the Danaides has left an indelible mark on Western art, literature, and cultural consciousness. From ancient pottery to contemporary performance art, the myth has continuously evolved, reflecting the values, anxieties, and ideals of each era that embraced it. Their tale, of forced marriage, resistance, murder, and eternal punishment, touches on universal human experiences, injustice, duty, guilt, and the longing for redemption. In Greek and Roman times, the Danaides served as moral warnings and mythological embodiments of defiance and divine retribution. During the Renaissance and neoclassical periods, they were transformed into tragic symbols of beauty and fate. The modern and postmodern ages reshaped them into metaphors for existential struggle, psychological fragmentation, and the burdens imposed by society, especially upon women. Their myth has found echoes in philosophy, psychology, literature, and feminist theory, making the Danaides more than just figures from myth. They are archetypes. They embody the tragedy of those forced to act against their will, the torment of unending regret, and the resilience of those who endure through eternal suffering. The Danaides remind us that myths are not static stories of the past. They are living narratives, constantly reshaped by the present to explore the deepest truths of the human condition.